Okay, so overall, the 2AC was pretty good. So this speech will be the 2NC. I will stop and then I will upload the 1NR, which I know is kind of weird to do to have two speeches back to back, but it's what it is. It's how debate works, right? And so the order for the 2NC will be the counterplan and then the disadvantage. All right? And so, give me just a second, and make sure I get that. Okay, cool. All right. All right. So, with no further ado, and I'm just going to go whatever speed I go, but it's easier for you to get practice this way than it is for you to not. If you have questions are good about the 2NC. If you have questions about how I did the 1NR, that's fine too. All right. I look forward to hearing from you all soon. All right. And on the counterplan, first an overview. The counterplan solves the case and avoids the movement's disadvantage. Even if they win the solvency deficit of the counterplan, we will still prove that there's no solvency for the affirmative. There's two ways that this is true. One, the counterplan could ultimately result in the plan. The Clark evidence from the shell indicates that the advisor would be in charge of STEM education. This means the counterplan would result in someone who would actually solve the standards, focus, and input of the plan. However, the orders matter. Our Clark evidence also says that when the plan happens, it would happen without the input from the scientific community on what standards are used in that kind of information. This means that the permutation includes passage of the plan but doesn't meet the best standards, and the counterplan would solve better by itself. And two is the counterplan by itself sends a signal to combat climate change and focus on science. This means the counterplan by itself is sufficient. It's the simplest move to just vote negative. This is Goldman in 17. Obama takes several important steps to address the issue of scientific integrity. He elevated the science advisor position to the report once again directly to the president. This signaled to a federal agency that scientific integrity would be a priority of the administration, and the OSTP solves the case and provides key leadership on all other impacts. The counterplan provides global peace due to international relations. This is an external net benefit of the counterplan, which means even if we don't solve the case as well, it's still a good idea to do the counterplan. Wrench in 17, OSTP provides the president with aspects of economy, national security, homeland security, health, foreign relations, the environment, and technological recovery, as well as the use of resources. It also puts a spotlight on STEM education. One of OSTP's most important functions has been the work with the industry to give the president the best possible advice on science and utilize the strength of our security spur economic growth and technological innovation, and how the federal government can best organize and support the essential scientific research activities occurring in the government, industry, and academia that address national priorities. OSTP will ensure U.S. leadership in the global economy, enhance our essential infrastructure, attention to the nation's scientific enterprise is the essential element of presidential leadership. Let's go to the line by line first. They say permutation. My number one is that this would delay the counterplan for decades because the students would have to graduate. Now is key. That's our Clark evidence. Remember that as long as Trump doesn't have anything going on, that he is always going to be seen as a doofus, which means that it would never solve for the leadership. That's the external net benefit that I just read above. And two, the perm is a time frame permutation. This is bad. It's severance from the counterplan. The counterplan doesn't allow it to happen at a different time. It only happens immediately. There's no way for the negative to have the counterplan that would compete. This is a reason to reject the permutation. This is the only permutation that they offer, is to do it at different times, which would mean that the counterplan would never happen. That's a meaning that you have a unique choice between the affirmative and the counterplan. They say that students are taught well, but first, extend our evidence that we say they won't be taught well. The standards that would be established are always going to be established by the OSTP, meaning that without a scientist there, they're terrible standards. Even if the plan's a good idea, the way it's implemented isn't. And also, the lack of government positions hinder solvency for the affirmative. Filling the position of the OSTP is key to solving climate change. Henson in 18, 15 months ago, the Trump administration number two key science-related position remain unfilled. Now, all of the Senate confirmed positions of the OSTP remain empty with no nominations yet put forth. The missions of the government agency are critical to advancing the understanding of climate change, the backdrop against which many important geopolitical events of the 21st century will unfold. Failure to provide competent scientific leadership for agencies must deal with these problems is deeply concerning. And they make a theory argument that says it's unfair because we use the federal government, but my number one is that federal government is actually key to predictability. The topic says federal government, which means there should be no question about who the agent is. It's not like we're using China or like Missouri or some other random agent. My number two is the affirmative gets the plan text. We get everything else. That's the best way to determine the plan-focused debate. Plan-focused debate is actually good because they get to pick it. That's the best choice for them. And number three, there's no abuse on this. Make them show specific problems. Make them say one specific thing. We did this on this. There's literature about it, which means that it's sufficient. Number four, the fact that we aren't topical also proves that there's sufficient negative ground. We aren't advocating for any form of direct educational funding or regulation. This means that it should be our argument. And fine. Five, ultimately hard debate is good. Even if they win that it's bad, that it's hard for them, that's great because hard debate is good. Let's go to movements. Here's the overview. The disadvantage functions to turn the case and create an external issue of racism. Our Strauss evidence indicates that right now is the key time for the movement. Teachers are protesting. Students are out in droves. The only way to stop the movement is if the federal government comes in and changes things. That's our O'Day evidence. The plan is a unique thwarting of the movement because teachers and students feel as though that they are things they are being protesting for are being taken away. Instead of more control, they get less. Instead of public schools being a focus, it's DeVos' way. Remember that Betsy DeVos loves private schools. That's actually the reason that she is the Department of Education secretary, because Trump loves that as well, which means that it's bad. This creates racism, which you should always reject. Let's go to the line by line. They say inherency proves money is getting there now, but number one, no one sees that. People don't know it's happening, which means the movements are continuing. We'll always control the fact that, like in Arizona and Missouri and a lot of other places, that teachers and other people have been protesting. Number two, the movement is growing now. The movement is gaining ground. Teachers are pushing against the market-based solutions to education. Drill on June 10th, that's like Sunday. We are witnessing a proliferation because of hope. The school year ends. Thousands of courageous teachers throughout the United States led mass movements and demonstrations, walkouts, and strikes. Power of collective resistance being mounted in full force against the neoliberal logic that is unabashedly insists the rule of market is more important than the needs of the teachers, students, young people, and poor, and those deemed disposable by the will of our society. And they say we exaggerate the movement, but that's not true. The focus on public schools is the key portion of the current movement. Dro again, the public schools are at the center of the manufactured breakdown, the fabric of everyday life. They are under attack because they are failing, but because they're public. They symbolize the centrality of education as a right and public good whose mission is to enable young people to exercise those modes of leadership and governance which they can become fully free to claim their own moral and political agency, rejecting the idea that the education is commodity to be bought and sold. Teachers and students across the country reclaiming education, the public good and human right and protective space that should be free of violence and open critical thinking. And learning not only is a place to think, engage in critical dialogue and engage in human potential and contribute to the vibrancy of democratic polity, it's also a place which social flourishes, and the students and the teachers learn to act and think together. And they say that it should be happening now because Trump's talking about STEM, but if anything, they believe that Trump is going to be talking about privatization because that's DeVos' position. Everything that he does pushes for that. So even if they think that STEM is good, they're only going to think it's going to be happening in private schools. And they say that STEM is key to solve racism, but privatization is worse. James, our evidence, gives three evidence. First of all, it says that it's informed by cultural deficit model. Second, it presents unreasonable educational alternatives. And three, it racializes the school experience. And also, privatization is specifically bad for science education. It creates bad science and locks in problematic views of climate change. This actually turns the case. Washburn 7. Industry-funded studies are subject to far less oversight than comparable federally funded study. Can also avoid external scrutiny by simply being labeled confidential business information. Should the public come to believe that scientific issues are settled, their views on global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to make a lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. The U.S. government strengthen its investment in science and basic science, the quintessential public good that only the federal government can properly fund. The reward of basic research is risky and diffuse, making it difficult for individual companies to invest in. Some critics of privatization say that more public funding is pivotal, not just for basic science, but for public health and regulatory science as well. One of the genies out of the bottle. It's not easy to get back in. The more public sector scientists become invested in the status quo through industry grants, parents, and the like, the less likely they're going to get support from reforms. Not so long ago, academics and government scientists ensured the basic building blocks of science were freely available to everyone, which means that if it pushes back to privatization and to corporate schools, remember that they're going to do dumb things when it comes to science, which means it actually turns the case. And the continuing of public school movement is key. Attacking the public schools spills over the issues. Only the movement can solve issues like global conflict, racism, poverty, and climate change. This turns the affirmative Dro 18 rather. The teacher strikes and walkouts of past grassroots moments will no longer allow the apostles of neoliberalism, the Republican Democratic Party, the financial elite to ruthlessly take apart the public education. It's crucial that such struggle connect to their struggles over the schools on a broad struggle that appeals to the parents who still view public schooling as one of the few avenues that children have for coming economic and social mobility. If the American society is to offset the deeply anti-democratic populist revolt that is a fascist government put in power in the United States, progressive is another new language that connects the crisis of schooling to the crisis of democracy, while at the same time rejuvenating the equation of capitalism and democracy. The attack on the public schooling is symptomatic of a more profound crisis that involves the extension of the market principles to every facet of power, culture, and everyday ill. Public schooling under siege, along with values and social relations, will give viable meaning to the common good, economic justice, and democracy itself. Schools can no longer be viewed as zones of political, economic, and social abandonment. The striking teachers across the country make it clear that everyone has the right to both live in an educated society and democracy, and you cannot have one without the other. Striking teachers, hopefully, will turn the movement into a moment, and in doing so, will make it clear that there's no contradiction between the struggle for quality public schools and fighting other injustices, poverty, mass incarceration, unchecked inequality, massive student death, systemic violence, escalating military resistance in society, and war on the planet. Education is a symptom of a deeper, dangerous, and more fundamental crisis. The deeper analysis and action is root of the causes. All right, so that's all that I needed to get to on the debate, and so that's the 2 and C. I'll pause and go ahead and put up the 1 and R here in just a second, okay? If you have any questions about the 2 and C, feel free to ask. Thanks.